Greetings, I'm John Duvall. Welcome back to another Truth Factor discussion. We'd like to thank you so much for joining us for our study today. It means so much to us that you take time out of your busy schedule to study the Word of God with us. Here in a few minutes, we're going to be picking up, and my camera just froze up again. All right, bear with me a second. There we go. I'm going to keep going. We'll fix it here in a minute. Get past all the intro stuff because of the technical difficulties I'm having on this end, and we'll leave it as is. It was a beautiful introduction. Tom, you know what happened? I was faded to black during the whole introduction.
Yes. Yeah.
So they heard or saw nothing.
Exactly.
So I tried to repeat it. My camera says I'm going to...
Here we go. Take two.
Yeah, I'm not going to do it again now. Hey, by the way, if you'd like to participate in our study, if you've joined us for maybe this is the first time, you can do so on our live Facebook stream as well as our live YouTube channel. You'll see a comment chat section in both areas there. Feel free to jump in there. You can also email us at questions@truthfactorlive.com, questions@truthfactorlive.com, or email us individually as you see on the screen there. All right, let's see. Let's bring everybody back. And we'll just see how this is going to go this morning. For some reason, it's starting to yell at me. And I'll figure out why here in just a minute. All right, so, gentlemen, we left off last week having studied up to John chapter 11, verse 31. And we're going to pick up this morning with verse 32. The background of this is pretty straightforward. Jesus, who had healed a number of people, was called by Mary and Martha because Lazarus was sick. And the whole thought is, we kind of talked about this last week, a little bit different viewpoints on it. But their mindset, for most of the people, we'll see this here in a minute, if you get there in time, you can save him. But then he dies, Lazarus does, and Jesus reveals it to his apostles, and they say, well, let's go with him anyway. And so when they arrived at their destination, Martha meets Jesus, and then Mary does. And let's pick up with Mary's part of this. I'll tell you what, let's do something better. Paul, let's back up to verse 28, and let's start reading in John 11:28, and let's read through verse 37. That'll let us get into discussion a little bit better here.
Okay, I'll be happy to do that. John 11:28, and how far down did you want to read?
37.
37, okay.
Yeah.
That sounds great. John 11, beginning at verse 28, looks like I'm reading out of the New King James Version. And when she had said these things, she went her way and secretly called Mary, her sister, saying, "The teacher is come and is calling for you." As soon as she heard that, she arose quickly and came to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the town, but was in the place where Martha met him. Then the Jews who were with her in the house, and comforting her, when they saw that Mary rose up quickly and went out, followed her, saying, "She is going to the tomb to weep there." Then, when Mary came where Jesus was, and saw him, she fell down at his feet, saying to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Therefore, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her weeping, he groaned in the spirit and was troubled. And he said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." And some of them said, "Could not this man, who opened the eyes of the blind, also have kept this man from dying?"
All right. Thank you, Mr. Paul. So going back there to where we were looking at, and this is, of course, picking up where we left off at, it's interesting what Mary says to Jesus when she sees him. You know, her response right away was, "Lord, if you'd been here, he wouldn't have died." Is that reasonable?
Yes. It's a great statement of faith. I don't think it's an accusation. Why couldn't you have been here? But yeah. I think it's, oh, if you had just been here. You know, it's that idea there, and a great statement of faith that you could have kept this from happening because we know who you are.
Yeah. He had shown plenty of times before that he could have healed Lazarus. You know, but
I wonder if verse
Go
37
ahead.
is a bit of an accusation where it's said a second time. I kind of wonder if that is an accusation.
Yeah, oh, yeah.
from the people who were there with him.
Yeah, I think I agree with
Yeah.
I agree with Brian on that, but I think in the case of Mary and Martha, not so much.
Yeah.
But
Martha did the same thing that Mary did.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. But you know, it's interesting. Just be reminded. I think we a little last week engaged in a discussion of noting the purpose of miracles, and it was more of to instill belief in individuals. So what Mary and Martha are requesting wasn't. I'm not saying it wasn't possible, but it wasn't so much in line with why Jesus performed miracles. You know, even though you do have some examples, like he healed Peter's mother-in-law, but that would instill faith. But here you have an observation. You know, here's a brother, and it's a personal desire.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a good point. It's a good point. Because both Martha and I think, Bob, you mentioned this, both Martha and Mary basically had the same response.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah. And so Jesus, of course, says, "Where have you laid him?" And they say, "Come and see." So any thoughts on the simple phrase is so eloquently divided up for us by man? The shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept.
Except for Greek. There's a shorter verse if you read it in Greek, but I don't
Really?
remember where. Yeah. I think it's Philippians. Rejoice evermore, I think is what it is. It's
Oh,
actually
okay.
shorter if you read it in Greek.
That's all Greek to me. See, you've just messed up thousands of posts on social media now. You know,
Yeah.
hundreds of thousands of posts.
All the trivia questions, what is the shorter verse in the Bible?
Exactly. Yeah, yeah.
I've
So,
heard people sometimes, John, kind of be almost critical of those who maybe are weeping and are very sorrowful at a death, saying, "Well, but you know that they were faithful, or you know that they're better, you know, in a better place, and things like that." And here, I think the thing that I learned is that the death of a friend, regardless of if that person had a great faith or not, the death of a friend is a time of sorrow. It's a normal thing. I'm more intrigued, I think, by what it means when it says he groaned in verse 33, because I think now I've heard that explained some ways, that the idea of death was just so unpleasant for Jesus, and so awful that because of sin there's death, that here, you know, he sees that humankind, people have to go through this all the time, you know, death of loved ones and things, and he found it so offensive, the idea of death. And I don't know if that's exactly right, or if I'm even saying it exactly right, but I think that's a really intriguing phrase to me. He groaned in the spirit and was troubled, in the New King James.
You know, I had occasion years ago when I was in Alabama to be at the bedside of a man who was, I don't know how old he was. He was nearing 100, I think, and not expected to live much longer. And his wife had been dead for years. And he was so sad, not that at his coming death, but at the fact that he would never, of course, it had been some time since he had seen his wife, because she had already been dead, that he would never know her again as his wife. And so I think that's what saddens so many people. As Paul said, it's not that they don't have faith and confidence that they're going to be in heaven. It's just that earthly ties are hard to break up. I mean, look at divorce. Even when you've got scriptural grounds for divorce, that can tear you up. even if you don't have, when so I can understand weeping, and we are to weep with those who weep, and that's what I see Jesus doing. Also, when it says Jesus wept, I think that is him weeping with those who were weeping. But as far as the groaning, I don't think that is a groaning of disappointment. But again, I think he's groaning over the fact that they all so loved Lazarus and went through this agonizing death. I don't know how long he had been sick, but Jesus put off returning for 2 days, and so over those 2 days he had died, and now it was the fourth day that he's dead and has been buried, and so at any rate,
Yeah, yeah.
he felt that pain for them. All right.
I like Bob's comment there, because I think of in Acts chapter 20 where Paul talks to the Ephesians and tells them, "I'm never going to see you again," and Paul cries and they cry. Bob, that was just a real neat comment. It makes me think of that idea. So I have a different view on this passage that I know is as controversial as we're going to allow. So I think that while I do believe absolutely Jesus has compassion on us and Jesus shares our grief and sorrow, I actually don't think that's what's happening here. And I'll give you a couple of thoughts as to why. First of all, verses 32 through 38 have this expression about groaning twice. And if you notice each time, it's when somebody says, "Jesus, had you just been here, things would have been different." Now I'll remind you to think about that passage in light of something like Matthew chapter 8, where Jesus is talking to the centurion and wants to be somebody heal, and the centurion says, "You don't have to be here to heal. You could just say it. You have authority. You could just say it." And Jesus says, "That's I'm going to paraphrase. That's the kind of faith I'm looking for." So there's something to these statements that even if they're not accusatory, they are problematic. They are saying, "Well, Jesus, you had to have been here to fix this, and because you weren't here, it didn't get fixed." And so right away, that can be a problematic statement. So both times Jesus groans within himself, it's right after those statements are made. And it might be that this could be an emotional, I hate for them to suffer. But at least one of those times we said in verse 37 almost sounds like it's accusatory, even if it's not from Mary. And this will be the third time it gets said in this chapter. The last time does sound a bit accusatory, so we'll go there. Now the Greek word here that is translated as groaning is a very specific word. And it's not the idea of groaning with sorrow or grief. It is specific to anger, to being angry. In fact, a lot of times the word's not translated as groaning, it's translated things like rebuke or, respond. It's very interesting that those terms for groaning aren't about I'm so sad, or it's a kind of moment. That's the groaning Greek word that there is something frustrating and angry. So I tend to think that within that context and in the middle of those two statements, Jesus is weeping, that while I don't deny Jesus is compassionate and sorrowful, when Jesus has emotionally reacted in the past, it's been typically because of the disbelief of his own apostles. In fact, what's interesting, if you look at the only time where the Bible specifically uses the word angry with Jesus, he's angry with his own disciples. Even when he's purging the temple back in John 2, the word angry doesn't come up, the word zeal comes up. But when Jesus is angry, it's almost always because his disciples aren't walking in a faithful way. So my take on this passage is not that Jesus is emotionally caught up in this moment. And I've often thought about this. It really wouldn't make sense if I'm about to raise this person from the dead. I'm about to turn your sorrow into joy. That's kind of what, he says a little later on when he's telling him about his resurrection. He says, "I know you're going to be sad, but I'm about to turn your sorrow into joy." He's moments away from turning their sorrow into joy. And while I can imagine that there is a lot of sorrow there, it's not going to be very long. It's kind of like, if I had some terrific piece of good news and everybody's mourning somebody's funeral and I get to come in and tell her he's not dead, he's alive. I wouldn't go in there and cry with them. I would go in there excited. I would go in there saying, I know you're all upset, but something wonderful is about to happen. And that's what he said back to Martha earlier. I am the resurrection and the life. I'm it. So as I said, my take is a little different, and it doesn't necessarily contradict anybody. Again, certainly to the idea that Jesus can be sympathetic and such. But I think maybe the language of all these passages together is telling us something a little different than we sometimes think.
So, Brian, you're saying you think that Jesus was kind of angry with the fact that they wanted Jesus to have been there, or that with the disciples. And I understood that word does mean kind of that angry, and what I had heard, and I'm not an expert in ancient languages. I remind people of that all the time, but that yes, it was angry, but it was angry at death itself. But I appreciate that. That really is insightful, and
I appreciate those comments, Brian, and I do not take it personally that you disagree with me. But matter of fact, you changed my mind as you spoke, because I can see now that their faith seemed to come to a short end there when he died.
Mm-hmm.
That's just that. You could have been here. You could have done something. Can't nothing be done now. He's dead. But that was not the end of it. When Jesus is around, death is not necessarily death or final. Because look how many, he raised 3 people from the dead that we know of. The son of the widow of Nain, Jairus' daughter, and now Lazarus. And at different stages of their death, Jairus' daughter had just died. The widow of Nain's son was on his way to be buried. And now Lazarus had been buried for 4 days. But their deaths were not final. And of course, there are, even in the Old Testament, Elijah and Elisha had both raised a boy from the dead. And there may have been other examples of that in the Old Testament. And certainly in the book of Acts, you've got Peter raising Dorcas and Paul raising Eutychus from the dead. And so where there's a man of God who has miraculous ability, death is not necessarily final. But again, he doesn't raise the dead just to be raising the dead.
Mm-mm.
It always has a purpose. And a greater purpose was accomplished by raising him from the dead than would have been accomplished by healing him. Yeah. Which is what he was hinting to his apostles about earlier in the chapter.
I'm just glad to know Brian agrees with me.
Yeah.
To me, that makes the most sense, that in both cases, when they said, Lord, had you been here, he would not have died. I think it was a statement that at that moment, it wasn't that they were, well, if he doesn't get here in time, he can raise him from the dead. They really thought that Jesus, that was the last resort. Jesus had to be there in order to heal him, and if he died, then they basically gave up hope. Interesting to note that with the LSB, Legacy Standard Bible, they render it, let me bring it up on the screen there. When Jesus therefore saw her crying, and the Jews who came with her also crying, he was deeply moved in spirit and was troubled. And they have a footnote by the word deeply moved, I think would be the same as groan or indignant. And so I think, and I like Brian's explanation. There were a number of times that Jesus seemed to be upset, if you would, and it had to do more with the lack of faith on the part of his people, And Mark uses the term, if memory serves, hard-hearted, stiff-necked, a few times in reference to even the apostles in their understanding. And, okay. There were a couple of comments here. David Clark, I missed his a little ways back. So let me go ahead and bring it in here for just a moment. And he says they wanted Jesus to heal every time, all the day. And when he doesn't, they're disappointed. But Jesus couldn't be everywhere. That's an interesting point. Jesus didn't heal everybody. But you kind of think that's maybe what sometimes they might have been thinking. when you look at Mark chapter 6, I believe it is, the multitude be coming going all day with Jesus, and he and his disciples decide to find a deserted area, a quiet area to go to. And then the people follow him, and he looks out over them as a sheep without a shepherd. You know, they were continually coming to him because of their great need. Let's see. And then, yeah, okay. That was a significant one I wanted to bring out there, I believe. All right. Any thoughts or comments about this?
You know, John.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that just kind of comes to my mind is, you know, we've heard how there's three different times that we read about Jesus weeping, and the other two times, one is in Luke 19, where he's weeping over Jerusalem, their rejection. And then the third time you have Hebrews 5, where, you know, as he was praying in the garden and so on, with loud cries and tears, he was heard because of his reverence. There's so much to be said about the idea of Jesus weeping, and I lean toward, like, I think the point that Brian was making about this. Yes, there was compassion, but it wasn't just compassion. There's so many things. I mean, sin, you know, the brokenness of the world, and everything associated with that. You know, it's interesting. I got a book here called, let's see, How to Study the Bible. This is by Mike Davis, you know, who used to be.
Oh, I know him, I think.
Yeah, exactly. Used to be on the panel here and stuff like that, and he might still be listening. But you know, I'm dealing with studying the Bible, and it's kind of interesting. In one of the illustrations he gives in this book, he mentions John 11:35, and he makes the point that he had a preacher friend, and the two of them said, "Let's see how many verses we can come up with that are related to John 11:35 in one way or another." And he said by the time we got done, we stopped after several years, because in reality, most of the New Testament, and probably a good portion of the Old Testament, in one way or another, is tied to that expression. You know, I mean, there's a lot to it when you just consider the humanity of Jesus. You consider what he knows, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. I think it's a good point. Good point. All right. Anything else? Let's see. Brian, you were thinking about Mark 3:5 earlier.
Yeah, I just mentioned that one of the few times Jesus had this kind of reaction, it was angry and grieved, kind of is because of a hardness of hearts. Yeah.
I feel like
And
Jesus did
yeah.
have a lot of palm slaps too with his apostles, because they were so
Yeah.
good at times.
Then verse 4, then he said to them, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? But they kept silent. When he looked around at them with anger, being grieved by the hardness of their hearts, he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he goes through the process there of restoring it. That's interesting, Brian. Yeah. Interesting. All right, let's see. Let's come back now to our study. All right. I've looked under the bridge. Don't see any more trolls, so... Okay, so Jesus asked them for us, where have you laid him? And so they say, come and see. We talked about Jesus weeping. And the Jews saw Jesus weeping, and what was their observation?
See how he loved.
He loved him, and why didn't he heal him? You know, we've seen this guy restore sight to the blind. And I agree with Tom. I think this definitely was an indictment. He restored the sight to the blind. Why couldn't he have healed this person? Kept him from dying. And you know, ultimately, isn't that the role of Christ? To keep us from dying. Not talking about physical death, but once he gives us life, God gives us life through Jesus Christ. Ephesians chapter 2. We who were once dead in our trespasses and sins, God has made us alive through Jesus Christ. And then as long as we serve him, he keeps us alive. He keeps us from dying spiritually again, being, you know, no longer being separated from God, but walking in fellowship with him. Okay. All right, so let's pick up now with verse 38. And Mr. Brian, if you would, let's continue the rest of this account, and we'll read through verse 38, please.
I'm sorry, starting at 38, going to where?
44. Sorry.
44.
I didn't say that. Yeah.
All right. All right. So reading from the New King James. Then Jesus, again groaning in himself, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of him who was dead, said to him, "Lord, by this time there is a stench. He's been dead for 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not say to you that if you would believe, you would see the glory of God?" Then they took away the stone from the place where the dead man was lying. And Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me, and I know that you always hear me. But because of the people who are standing by, I said this, that they may believe that you sent me." And when he said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come forth." And he who had died came out, bound hand and foot with grave clothes. His face was wrapped with a cloth. And Jesus said to them, "Loose him and let him go."
All righty. Thank you, sir. So last week, the name I was trying to remember, Brian threw it in our private chat, and I never saw it. Back in 2013, Marty Pickup had written a pretty interesting paper, research paper, and had presented a lecture down at Florida College on the significance of Jesus being in the tomb for 3 days. And he related that to the belief of the Jews at the time period, in regards to they could come and go to the tomb for up to 3 days. But by the time of the third day, they knew that the decomposition was beginning and the tomb would need to be rolled and there would be a stench about the body. And so the point, it's ultimately the point in the paper, is that Jesus arose even before that point. He arose 3 days. So he makes a reference, and guys, I put this link in our Facebook chat we have, and I put the link also on last week's video. So if you go to last week's video, you should be able to see the link to the actual recording of the lecture, and I think I dropped in a link to the PDF as well of the document that he wrote. But anyway, the point is, the reason why Mary said, "Surely he stinks by now," is the experience said you need to have the tomb closed by the end of the third day, because the body will be, the decay process really becomes strong, and you don't want to open the body. You don't want to open the tomb after that point, not until 12 months later when the bones have fully lost, the skin has decomposed, and then they go gather the bones up and put them in an ossuary so more people could be put in there. So that's why she says, "Lord, by this time there is stench, for he has been dead 4 days." Any thoughts about that in regards to the significance of this miracle?
What occurs to me is that when Jesus was buried, there was an immediate placement of a stone at the opening of the tomb, because he said, "I will be raised in 3 days."
Yeah.
And so it had to be done before the third day, or else he could get out.
Good point.
And so that's what they want. They wanted to prevent him from getting out if he did raise. But what they didn't realize is, even if the stone had not been rolled away, he could have got out. And so I think that's interesting, especially when you consider the fact that the guards would have been killed if it had come to Pilate's attention that Jesus' tomb was empty. And that's why the Jewish rulers assured these guards, "We'll take care of Pilate.
Yeah.
You don't have to worry about that." Just lie. And they gave him money.
Right.
It eliminates
Yeah.
any criticism that maybe there was something less than a miracle going on here.
Yeah.
That that it had been 4 days, and that it just not. I don't know that there's any validity or reason to that Jewish thinking about the body hovering around or staying around. But in any case, it's a miracle, even if you take that into account of what the Jewish leaders might have thought. So,
Yeah, and of course, tying into what Paul just said, there's no question. Nobody could deny that Lazarus is dead. That's the point of the day 4. If nothing else. Uh, because we're coming to the end of what we call the ministry of Jesus. I don't know what terminology you like to use for that, but the point is we're coming to the end of that time period. And one of the things that I've always noted about Jesus while he was preaching and teaching is the more his work progressed, the stronger it got. And we're getting closer to the time where Jesus needs to die. And if you know a modern expression, he's turned up the volume or he's turned up the dial. You see that in the miracles he's performing. Here he's raising somebody that was so dead that decay should have begun, and there's no arguing at all about this. Just like Matthew 23, I've heard that described as the straw that broke the camel's back. Well, this miracle is also a straw that broke the camel's back, as we shall see when we continue in chapters 11 and 12.
Yeah. Here's a question not answered in the text, I believe. When they opened the tomb, did the body stink? So,
Probably so.
see, I'm kind of wondering, because that would certify all the more, and I think Paul may have alluded to this too, that would certify the miracle all the more. If they opened the tomb and there was a small stench that had developed, instead of God keeping the body from decomposing, the Lord bringing the body back from that the state of decomposition.
But decomposition hadn't set in, except maybe it had begun, but not.
Yeah,
not fully.
yeah. Hence, they're being fearful of it smelling. Ultimately, there was no question he was dead,
Yeah.
and there's no question that Jesus gave him life.
Adding to the metaphors that Tom just used, Jesus was stoking the fire.
Yeah.
Yep. Exactly. Good way to describe it.
Verse 40, did I not say to you that if you would believe, you would see the glory of God? What about his prayer in verse 41 and 42? Any thoughts about that? So let me bring it back up on the screen for everybody real quick. He says, Father, I thank you that you've heard me, and I know that you always hear me, but because of the people who are standing by, I said this, that they may believe that you sent me. Any thoughts about that?
I have wondered for a long time whether Jesus has already uttered a silent prayer for the restoration of Lazarus. And all that remains is to let him out of the tomb. And now he's saying something. He's making a verbal prayer here, so they'll know that he has been in contact with the Father, and that at his request, Lazarus has been made alive. That's my thinking, anyway.
That's possible, yeah.
I don't know if it's a valid point or not, but you probably heard, like I have, that the reason Jesus said, Lazarus, come forth, was because if he had just said, come forth, his word was so powerful as the Son of God that all the dead would have come forth at his calling, or all the dead in that within the hearing of that voice or whatever. I don't know if that's really a point to make or not, but it certainly expresses great confidence and faith in the power of God of why he says that. But I know that when he raises Dorcas, he speaks to her and some other of them. I think on one case he says young girl or something, but I don't know. That may be. I've always wondered if I'm making too much about that when I recall that some have taught that or not, but it's a powerful message.
Yeah, and also, going back to the prayer that Jesus does offer and so on, you find an example here of actually teaching in a prayer, which is something that I find interesting. I don't necessarily think that in our prayers we ought to be preaching sermons and so on, but I've heard of individuals quote scripture in prayer, and I've heard of people say, well, you don't need to do that. And my question is, why not? I mean, I don't have a problem with it either way. But here we have Jesus using this as an option. Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know you always hear me, but because of the people standing here, I've said this so that they will believe. So you've got that observation that Jesus is saying something in a public way, and it's definitely a prayer, a request to God, but at the same time, he wants those who hear this, maybe they're following along, maybe they're not, but he wants them to understand that this is also for them. This miracle wasn't just about Lazarus. As a matter of fact, it wasn't about Lazarus in a roundabout way. I'm reminded of Elisha. Or Elijah, or not Elijah, but Samuel. Samuel when Saul went to the witch, and he basically said, "Why are you bothering me?" I kind of wonder that with Lazarus. We don't know anything about it, but where was he for those 3 days? And I guarantee a lot of people had questions, and from that, if there was any consciousness whatsoever. But here, Jesus wants them to believe. He wants the people to believe, and he mentions that in his prayer.
Well, we do know that Jesus, while he was dead, his soul was in Hades. We got scriptural testimony to that.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, when he says, "Today you'll see me in paradise,"
and when Peter quoted David,
yeah,
in Acts 2.
"You will not leave my soul in Hades," and so he had to be there before he could be left there or not.
And likely there was some consciousness in that.
Yeah, I mean, everybody in Hades, it seems to me, is conscious, whether they're in paradise or torment.
Yeah, exactly. And by the way, just so that all know, and I'm sure all our audience understands this, Hades is not hell.
That's right.
It's the realm of the dead, basically.
It is the realm of the dead, exactly.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
There is a religious comedian who speaks about this and talks about how Lazarus, he's in this place of comfort, and he might express it a little differently, but to try to be as accurate as I can, he's in a place of comfort, and all of a sudden, knock, knock, knock. Hey, you're going back. And, oh no, but I'm sure that the Lord, in every way that was appropriate and right, that he took care of all of that. So,
yeah. He must have had confidence that Lazarus would once again be a man of faith and would be until he died finally.
yeah.
All right, let's see. Man, there's so many questions and stuff we could talk about with that, but let's not. It's interesting.
I do want to add one more thing. I said this last week. I'll say it one more time. This is not a resurrection. This is a being raised from the dead. And the distinction here is that Lazarus is going to die again. And I often like to make that point to say every miracle that Jesus performs on earth is temporary. He feeds people, they'll be hungry the next day. He raises people from the dead, that they're going to die eventually, because that's the nature of the world around us. And the whole point of miracles was not to solve our problems, because our real problem of death can only be solved by the resurrection. And that's the point where we're raised, we're transformed, we become eternal. Or flesh and blood can't enter into the kingdom of heaven. We can enter heaven. We have to be transformed. And so I kind of like to say, I kind of point out, hey, Lazarus was raised from the dead, but he'll die again, because his real issue isn't physical death. It's this idea of being cut off from God. And so I do kind of like to point out that's why Jesus is the first fruits of the resurrection. He's the first person that was resurrected. He wasn't the first person raised from the dead. He's the first person that's been resurrected.
Something else that has caught my eye here in verse 40. Did I not say to you that if you would believe, you would see the glory of God? When did he tell Martha that? He did say back up there, if you believe, he who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live. Whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? But to me, that is the essence of seeing the glory of God. That Lazarus would, your brother will rise again. She would see the glory of God in seeing the resurrection of Lazarus, or the raising of Lazarus. And I appreciate Brian's point. Although I have heard Ron Daly say that the same word is used for raise, but I do see a difference there. Jesus is the firstborn from the dead, not being the first one to be raised from the dead, but the first one to be raised from the dead forevermore, raised from the dead, not to die again, as Brian pointed out. And so to me, there is a difference between Jesus raising somebody and Peter and Paul raising somebody and Jesus being resurrected.
Interesting. Did you just say tomato?
I guess so. Clamato.
Actually, I think both are interesting aspects of that. I think, Paul, you were the one that made the statement initially, didn't you? That he was raised, not a resurrection. And I understand that. That's a very interesting point, and I can see the behind that. But then Bob made some good points. So as I stand on the middle of the fence, catch me if I fall one way or the other, would you?
I believe it was Brian and Paul.
Yeah, well, it was not me.
I tried, Brian.
Do all of us bald guys look the same? Yeah, do all of us bald guys look the same? Is that it? You just can't
I think that's what he's saying. They all look the same.
That's what he's saying, yeah. They all look
If you had a flannel shirt on and Paul had a goatee, yeah.
Yeah, there is a difference. Brian's hair fell from his head to his face.
Yeah.
And that's
you're both bald, you're both wearing glasses. How are we supposed to tell you apart?
All right, let's see.
There's one other real quick lesson that I think is interesting. Jesus said, "Take away the stone," and they rolled the stone away. And I've always made the application to this that God does what we can't do, but this is an illustration of, even by faith, we need to do our part. You find that with take away the stone, and you're also going to find it when he says to loose them. So you've got that's just another interesting lesson of
that's interesting.
You do what you can.
And Jesus could have miraculously moved that stone. He could have levitated it out of the way, and he could have loosed the bonds without touching him.
Yep.
But they had to do their part.
That's neat you bring that up, Tom.
They are showing some faith.
It's neat you bring that up, Tom. I've actually got a sermon on that too, called
Open
the Tomb. Yeah, Open the Tomb. That the idea is that, they could have argued with Jesus and said, no, it's going to smell too bad, just a mistrust or something. But Jesus is offering to fix their big problem, but they have to expose it. They have to open it up. And I've often said Jesus is offering to fix our biggest problems, but there's something dead inside of us that has to be opened up, that we have to acknowledge is dead. And the idea of repentance from dead works is opening a tomb where there's a dead body and letting Jesus fix it. And they could have argued, and they kind of start arguing, it's not a good idea to open the tomb. And Tom, I would suggest the point you're saying is that had they just argued with Jesus, maybe he wouldn't have raised him from the dead, or, and I'm just speculating, but just to say, if we argue with Jesus, and I don't want to expose myself to I don't want to let my sins be open and everywhere because they stink, then perhaps he wouldn't fix our problem.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. And of course, building on that, if for those who are listening and are looking for sermon ideas, the next point is, what are some stones that you need to take away?
Now, what monthly subscription is this to greatsermons.com? How much is that?
Exactly.
Well, start on Truth Factor. Subscribe to us. Send us $49.99 a month, and you'll hear suggestions for great sermons.
We'll send you one sermon a month. How about that?
Yeah, it'll pay for the Zoom. I'm kidding. Please don't do that.
By the way, one of my faithful listeners on Bob's Bible Basics, Becky Renee, has been posting a lot of great stuff on her Facebook page.
I saw that.
And
That ain't scriptural, is it? I'm kidding.
Oh yeah, it's
I saw the discussion over that.
It wouldn't be scriptural for her to preach it in a mixed congregation.
Oh yeah.
She can write a sermon for you,
Yeah.
and she got plenty on there that you could use.
One more thought about this. Y'all brought another instance to mind when y'all were talking about it. I think it's a great idea for a lesson. What about Mary, Jesus' mother, at the wedding feast in Canaan, where she said to the people, whatever he says do, go ahead and do.
Yeah.
A little bit different scenario, but yet it's that confidence in, okay, you want to go to Judea? We'll go with you, and we'll die with you,
Yeah.
Now,
but
the interesting thing about Mary is we don't have any recorded miracles prior to that. So that's kind of interesting there.
Yeah, that's true.
But she knew who he was. If one person on this earth knew that Jesus was born of a virgin, it was Mary.
Yep. And knew he was destined,
That's a good
so
point.
to speak, to do something. Yeah.
And if he was not born of a virgin, she could have stopped the crucifixion.
Yeah.
By confessing not to be a virgin.
Good point.
And that was, we got his mother's testimony. And we don't have to now because he's been exposed.
All right, real quick, the last verse here, and I think this will be due to time. This will probably be a good stopping point, but look at verse 44. And he who had died came out bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was wrapped with a cloth. This was a normal burial process. Jesus said to them, loose him and let him go. It's an amazing miracle there. Okay.
I'm going to have to reverse my statement earlier. I said that I think he might have been raised before the stone was rolled away. But it says they rolled back the stone where the dead man was lying.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, he was still dead when they rolled back the stone.
Yeah.
And wasn't made alive until Jesus said, Lazarus, come forth.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
we're not as right as they usually am.
All right. Any other thoughts or comments about this? I think we'll stop at this point for the study, and we'll get into kind of the side effects or the repercussions, I should say, of this miracle once we pick back up. But any other thoughts? Okay. Let's plan. Tentatively, we're going to shoot for 2 weeks. Next week, of course, is the holiday week. And then the week after that should be January 1st or January 2nd. So we may target 3 weeks. Y'all want to do that? Kind of take 2 weeks off, take the 26th and the 2nd, and shoot for the 9th, roughly?
Let's do that.
Okay. If we have to go postpone 1 more week, we'll do that, of course. But we'll plan to be off for the definite 2 weeks as we go through this holiday season. Okay. All right. Any other thoughts or comments?
A good study, and I think this is a great example of how preachers can teach one another, and I
Yeah.
hope our audience can see that we're not claiming to be great authorities. Uh, we try to speak with one voice, but we don't always. But we try
Yeah.
to consider what each other says, and if we don't already believe the same thing, we'll try to shoot for that each time we come together to
Yeah.
study.
And that's the whole point. When we started Truth Factor, it was just Tom, Paul, and I back in 2012, I believe it was. And it was a fun thing to do. Three of us get together and we study the Bible together and bring people in because we could do it live stream back then. And that's been the ultimate goal. Not so much let's have a show where we try to teach everybody everything. It's just we're studying together and you might enjoy doing that study with us. And so we've disagreed at times. We've not seen things the same way, just like Bob was saying. But in the end, we grow in our understanding. Yeah. I just wish I was as deep as Tom and Paul on the rolling away the stone.
And it's never made any major difference. It's minute things, really, that matters of judgment and things of that nature.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Changing their doctrines, I don't think.
Yeah, that's exactly right. All right, guys, I guess we'll call it good for the year. This will be the last Truth Factor discussion for 2024.
Right?
That just
Well,
dawned on me.
I certainly enjoyed this year, being a part of this.
I appreciate that.
If some of our loyal friends who join us each week are going to really miss the next 2 weeks, they could always go to our website and pick up a previous study somewhere along the line that they might like to watch from the long ago past, from 10 years ago.
We're
We're also a podcast too. I don't know if everybody knows that, but there's also the Truth Factor podcast, which is
If you go back
available
far
on-
enough, you won't have to listen to Brian and Bob.
That's right.
It'll be really great.
It's just the three apostles, and then Brian and Bob. So
I tell you what, let me take just a half a second here, if I can do this real quick.
Ryan, I guess that would make you and me, Luke and Mark.
I like to think that, yeah.
There we go. All right, so so if you go to truthfactor.com, and people at home can see this, guys, you can't. You'll see archives right here in the menu. If you'll click there, the first thing listed in the archives is the audio podcast that Brian was referencing there. And his son has been very helpful. He's actually behind all of this right here and making them available. But then if you'll scroll down, I have our video playlist from YouTube listed topically. So we have topical studies and then Gospel of John, Gospel of Luke. And what happens if you click on one, let's go to the letter to Romans, it should bring you to our YouTube playlist of our study through Romans. And so as to what Paul was saying a while ago, there we go. If you go all the way down to, I think it's Jude. Do I have it all completed here? I don't know if I do. I may be missing. Anyway, go to Truth Factor, go to our YouTube page, which is youtube.com/Truth Factor Live, and go to our playlists, and you will see all of our past studies, including the very first study, I believe, is there as well. So,
And through the years, we've had other friends who have joined us. There's the young man, Daniel Duval, Royce,
yeah.
Mike Davis, all those guys, through the years who have been part of this and then moved on to do other things. And
Had Eric Reynolds.
Eric Reynolds. Eric was always
Seth,
a welcome addition.
Yeah.
Wayne Welch,
Wayne Welsh.
Yeah, Wayne.
Seth, what was his last name? What's his last name?
Seth McDonald.
That's it. Seth McDonald. And you already mentioned Mike Davis a while ago.
Yeah.
And so we've got others, and some like Brian joined us because he was a regular participant in the chat room. And Wayne was the same way. And so what we need to do is I need to grab Caleb Davis one day and see if he's got a camera. See, he's like us. He has a face for radio, So, but he has hair too, so that would help balance out the. Brendan also. Brendan's been.
Yeah,
with
I
us
was
for a
going to
good
say,
bit,
yeah,
too.
there was a guy named Brendan that used to be on the show. If you're listening, Brendan.
Yeah.
By the way, Brian was also a favorite chatter on ARE, and we finally brought him in, and he's been a big asset.
A bigger chatter. That's the problem.
Yeah.
That's the way Brian does it. He comes in, gets in there, and then he comes and says, "Okay, I'm in front of the camera now, so here's what I got to say."
I'm trying to get on the Baptist way, the same thing, but they're not letting me on.
All right. Okay, well, that's it. We appreciate y'all joining us for this week. We appreciate you joining us for this year of our study. We haven't been the full 2024, haven't we? We started back at started 2024, or was it 2023 we started back? I can't remember. We paused in 2020 for a couple of years and then started back again. All righty, well, we'll see you here, Lord willing, in 2 weeks, or 3 weeks technically, maybe 4, depending. But follow our Facebook page, which is at Truth Factor Live. Follow our YouTube channel at Truth Factor Live as well, and we'll have information, scheduled studies, and so forth listed there. All right, we appreciate all your participation and comments. Thank you, gentlemen, and we'll see everyone next year. Y'all have a good one now. All right, bye-bye.